Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first YouTube live chat at Doorbind. We're here and really excited that you with us to talk about this really exciting conversation. Just realized that this is our first time doing YouTube live, so there may be some issues that we emerge. Just bear with us as we kind of work through that. But we're really excited to chat with you today about our topic here, which is beyond psychosis, moving past the messy middle of meaningful recovery. Just to ground us a little bit, this conversation is for people with serious mental illness and those who support them. It's not a lecture or a roadmap based to fix anything tonight. We're here to name the phase of recovery that is common, difficult, and rarely explained. And so we also know that medication can stabilize symptoms or help to do so, but it's often not the whole story. So if we feel stuck, sometimes we're uncertain at this stage, and does it mean failure? Our plans evolve. And so I'd like to introduce our guests who are here to kind of help us have this conversation. We have Brittany, who is representing the coach. And then we also have Gale, who's representing the family perspective, and Hannah, who is representing the medical perspective. And we're going to give them opportunity to do some things here. We'll start with Brittany.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Troop. I am a Doro guide here, as well as a family coach. I have come to this work from my own lived experience as a caregiver as well, and really appreciate the work that goes into helping our loved ones through this messy middle phase. And so being able to be here with all of you, both as a coach as well as someone who's experienced this myself, I just know that this phase can be a lot for a lot of us to handle. So glad to be here with you all.
Thank you, Brittany. And we'll move on to Gale.
Hello, my name is Gale, and I'm a mom, an advocate, and a caregiver of a young man who became ill in 2014 when he was 20 and attending college. His stability began in 2019 when we found the right medication. He was 25 years old, and he slowly progressed since then. So I'm grateful for that, but we are in the messy middle of meaningful recovery. And I appreciate being here with all of you.
Gale, we appreciate you being here as well. Hannah, you're next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Bach. I am a Psych NP and come to this work from years working in public health systems where, a lot of the mental health systems and coordination structures have sort of failed families. So hope to bring that clinician perspective here.
Great. Awesome. We changed the format a little bit tonight as well. Some of you may know the Northeast has hit by a snow apocalypse that really kind of snowed us all out. And so this whole event today is now more virtual instead of us being together in person, but we hope you enjoy our time here today. So we're going to jump into our first area where we're trying to name this recovery plateau, try to help understand, like, what is it that we're talking about? Why does this phase feel so hard? So the first question that we have here, and a lot of these questions were also informed by people who submitted questions via the Google form, which was fantastic. What does this phase often feel like once symptoms are more stable, but life hasn't really reopened? And we'll start with Gale.
It's an interesting phase because I'm so very thankful he's stable. And I struggle with how much do you push, how much do you sit back, and then, what is the definition of the meaningful recovery? So I struggle with all those subjects, and I enjoy seeking other people's opinions, and I count a lot on Brittany with her experience and knowledge as well.
Thank you, Gale. Yeah, that's really meaningful. Brittany, from the family coach perspective, how would you address that question?
I think what I hear most from families, kind of echoing what Gale was saying, is there's this balance between the push and pull of how much do I encourage, do I push, do I cajole my loved one into doing the next thing, the next part of recovery, whatever that looks like for the individual, versus how much do I kind of step back and give some space for, them to kind of move things forward on their own. And I think for each individual, this sort of messy middle looks a little bit different, but it's oftentimes that, the more active crisis situation has calmed down, and we're all in this place of like breathing a sigh of relief and just like we can rest, but then sort of anxious for the next step. Like, how do we keep the momentum going? How do we keep ourselves moving forward even while resting? And this feels so much better. I think that's one of those things that I hear a lot from families.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. It's almost like you're on pins and needles a little bit because you never really know what's going to kind of happen next. Hannah, is there anything from the medical perspective that you'd like to kind of share on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I see with my patients commonly that the symptoms sort of dissipate very asynchronously, right? So like you may have some symptoms remain and some sort of disappear. Often positive symptoms will be reduced first, right? And then the negative and cognitive symptoms sort of will lag and take a longer time for us to see change. However, that's not true with every case, right? It can be very, very different with different people. So there is no real standard, but that puts families in this really ambiguous, uncertain state. And I think often prior to this state, there's this acute period where families know their role. And the new state is sort of becomes confusing because of that.
Hannah, you mentioned a couple terms there, positive and negative. Can you go into that a little bit more, and can you give some examples about what those mean, the positive and negative symptoms?
Sure. So positive symptoms are sort of what we think of as the typical symptoms of psychosis, right? Hallucinations, delusions, paranoia. Negative symptoms are related to sort of cognitive and functional and social impairments. So, for example, like flattened affect is a big one that we see frequently.
Got it. Thanks, Hannah. Appreciate it. So the next question I will have for you all is about why do energy and motivation and confidence often remain so fragile at this stage? And you all have kind of touched on it a little bit in the first question, but in particular, we're talking about energy, motivation, and confidence. Why does it seem to remain a little bit fragile at this stage in the messy middle? Again, we'll start with Gale.
I think that maybe it's because this illness is so tough, and you must lose so much of your confidence when you can't. You realize that you can't rely on your brain and your thoughts, and that reality must be. I just can't even imagine how hard that would be, and I think that's probably one of the hardest steps, is to regain your confidence. And I think in our case, our family plays a really important role, because the more we enforce the fact that he's doing better, that he's behaving in such a wonderful fashion as he used to, it gives him a little more confidence. It gives him a kind of a pat on the back, and I think that helps. But I think that might be one of the hardest things to overcome, is the lack of confidence.
Yeah, confidence really helps a lot of us kind of move past a certain area of stuckness. And so the more we can kind of think about confidence and try to fan that into flame, the better that might be. Brittany, from your perspective, how would you answer that question? Why do energy, motivation, and confidence seem to remain fragile at this stage?
I think there's a number of different, whys behind it. And I think as Hannah was mentioning earlier, those negative symptoms tend to be the ones that lag behind the positive symptoms, right? So that lack of energy and that lack of motivation is something that we're addressing as a secondary to those more active, acute psychotic experiences. And I think we undercut just how impactful those symptoms really are, because for us as caregivers, it's a lot easier to identify the things that might sound kind of scary or sound really confusing to us, like these different experiences that we can't, name. But the energy and the motivation, we've all experienced that, right? We've all experienced low energy. We've all experienced low motivation. But when you add that in this context of negative symptoms, one of my loved ones describes it as though she's been poured into concrete. And so she's just trying to trudge through concrete to try to do anything. And so, when you kind of think about what it would feel like, if you were trying to move through concrete to do your day-to-day life, that does impact your confidence, and it does, impact your ability to get back to some of those life activities.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that really helps us kind of understand a little bit more about why these things are so fragile at this time frame. Hannah, do you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, I think there's also like what you both were sort of alluding to, which is there's this, for the person who was in psychosis, there's this sort of like re-emergence of trying to understand their identity. And it's a new version of their identity. Yeah. And they're trying to integrate the person who they were before, then the person they were during the psychosis, right? Which is very hard to do, because we know, especially you sort of encode memories differently while you're in psychosis, especially. So it's very hard to integrate after the fact. And you're also trying to grapple with a lot of trauma that you probably haven't had a chance to reflect on, which, as we know, often just comes from interactions with the mental health system, especially hospitalizations, right?
It's a good segue. So we're going to move on to talking about living kind of in the tension of this messy middle. And this focuses on the relationship phase of things. So when this phase lasts longer than expected, it doesn't just affect the person experiencing it, it also starts to shape relationships, affect relationships. So as we dive into this, let's ask a few questions here. What kinds of tension tend to show up in this phase when everyone is trying their best? We'll start with Gale.
This is kind of a tough one, because I struggle in and try to remain patient and take one day at a time, which sometimes can be a little bit difficult. But I heard this one saying that I use all the time, and people are probably tired of hearing it, but progression rather than perfection is something I heard somebody say, and I thought, oh boy, I need to grab onto that, because even a quiet day where everything is smooth, and just maybe one little thing, like, your loved one makes their bed, that's, progression. It may not be perfection. He may not be out there working and going to school, but I'm grateful and thankful for those little signs of progression.
That's wonderful. Brittany, from your perspective, what would you say to this question? What kinds of tension tends to show up during this phase, even when everyone is trying their best?
I think one of the main tensions is around expectations, right? Every person in the relationship had their own expectations of what this stage would look like, feel like, how quickly we'd move through it. And I think I heard someone say once that managing expectations is the most important part of managing relationships. And when we're thinking about if we have these sort of hidden expectations that we're not voicing, there can become this tension. And it, kind of goes back to that earlier comment that we made about the push and pull, right? Of, I expected us to be a step ahead of this by now. Should I be pushing towards it or pulling towards it? And what do I do if I feel like my loved one's pulling back? And it could be because our loved one is in a different place of expectation, right? They expect this stage to look differently than we expect this stage to look.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's a difficult tension, and we're in it. And if we can kind of open our eyes, kind of peer and see it for what it is, we can kind of start to dissipate that tension just a little bit. Hannah, is there anything you want to add from the clinical perspective? That's my question.
Yeah, again, I see a lot of families having this like role confusion sort of after the acute phase has ended, where, they had this defined role before, during the acute phase, and it's different, and it's a huge adjustment, right? Like, are you a parent? Are you a caregiver? And what type of person within those two spheres are you going to be? How are you going to relate to this person now that they're in the new stage? So I see a lot of families trying to grapple with that, often in an unspoken way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you may have covered this a little bit in all of your responses, what do people often misunderstand about each other during this stage of recovery? And we'll start with Gale.
Well, in my case, my loved one is not real open to share sometimes, or maybe I just don't know how to ask the question correctly, and I'm working on that. So I don't know exactly what I may or may not be doing that affects him, in an adverse way. As far as my dealings with him, he has a great sense of humor, which is wonderful, and it's back. And so I try to use humor with him to prevent tension, and he thankfully is receptive to humor, which is a wonderful thing.
Humor is like a cure for a lot of malady. Brittany, how would you respond to that from your perspective as a family coach?
Yeah, I think it goes back to a lot of what Hannah was saying about these shifting roles that happen. And, especially when we're in this stage in like the early adulthood, we may have just changed roles, right? Like we went from being, caregiver, really directing life, into kind of letting go and then diving headfirst back into needing to be director role. And so when you have to then sort of shift back into how do I step more into a partnership type of position rather than a direct everything sort of position, while also sort of tenuously letting out the rope, right? Like it feels like we've kind of had this, like, I've had people describe as like whiplash sort of feeling, like things are moving so fast in different directions that I don't know where I stand today. And I think that's one of those things that we kind of like misunderstand about each other, is that, as much as we're experiencing that whiplash feeling, our loved ones are also feeling that whiplash feeling of like everything's changed and I don't know which version of us we're doing today.
Yeah, thank you, Brittany. That's really insightful, especially how you were kind of touching a little bit on like how important like agency is to each individual, right? And there's a perspective that's happening is there's people who are trying to do things at the same time, and no one's really in anyone's head, right? Like no one can really understand what's actually happening there. And so if we take the time to be a little bit more patient, try to look at it from an empathetic standpoint, that can kind of help us to kind of understand each other a bit more. Hannah, is there anything you want to add to that question as well from the medical perspective?
This isn't exactly from the medical perspective, but I think there's also a lot of trauma processing that's happening for families. They have been through this trauma just as much as the individual, or just in a very different way than the individual has, right? And I think there's a lot of emotional weight and sort of emotional lability that can come after the acute phase is done, just for the families, because they finally have this time to reflect and all these memories of these really complicated times, which then creates tension because their emotions are so impacted by processing that trauma.
Wow. That's really deep. There's one more question in this section before we kind of move on to the next one, but have ideas about a meaningful life started to shift, and what tension can that create? So when you're in the context of this messy middle, you may have had some idea of what meaningful recovery looked like, and then it began to shift. And what tension does that create amongst the relationship? Gale.
Well, I have my definition, and I often think to myself, well, maybe my definition is different than his definition. And we haven't really had that specific conversation, but I know that he is noodling through, what is success for me now? That, he had a definition of success before the illness. So now things are different. And I think he's noodling through it, although, as I mentioned before, he's not real vocal about his thought processes. And if I could learn how to ask the question the right way, where you kind of phrase it so that you're not really answering it for them, which is something I've kind of done all my life. So I've got to, I guess, study up on how to ask the question appropriately for him to answer. But I don't know what his definition is, and my definition shouldn't be his definition. So we just have to play that by ear. But maybe after this, we'll have a conversation, and I'll get a feel for what he's thinking.
That's great. That's great. And I think what you're touching on, I was having a conversation with Brittany, I think earlier this week or last week, and she touched on something very similar to what you were saying. But Brittany, from the family coach perspective, how would you answer that question about meaningful life shifting and the tensions that creates?
Yeah, I mean, just sort of echoing what Gale said, is that how we define meaningful recovery, I mean, sometimes it changes even for ourselves. And, I think a little bit around, there are definitions out there in the world, like SAMHSA has a definition of meaningful recovery that is, a process of change through which we live full and meaningful lives. And when I think about that, I mean, I raise my hand on that too, right? Is I'm trying to go through a process of change, living a full and meaningful life. And what that means to me today is different than what that meant to me 5 years ago, even without the interruption of going through the experiences of severe mental illness. And so, I think there's just this normal part of life where what living a full and meaningful life means to us shifts. And then when you have this interruption in that path forward, it changes the definition. And I think, as caregivers, it's really easy for us to anchor back on the definition our loved ones had before they got ill. And we often say, I want to go back to that, right? Like, I want to go back to what their hopes and dreams were. But backwards is never the direction any of us are going, right? We all should be striving forward. And I think that's one of the things that is really easy for us to lose sight of when we're in this process, is that we just have to be looking forward and at this new normal, whatever new normal is, and at this new definition of meaningful life, whatever that definition is for all of us, right? And it changes for us as caregivers too, right? What we expected from this chapter of our life might be different than what it was before. And so we're all kind of on this journey together, and that changes a lot of things.
I really like what you said about none of us are ever really looking to go backwards, right? And we should always kind of look forward, and being where we are now, and then allowing that to kind of progress over time. Hannah, from the medical perspective, do you want to chime in a bit here?
Yeah, I think, like I see from my patients that they have their social and functional expectations for like work, interactions with the community, with family. They tend to start shifting before their capacity does, right? We all do that, right? We all have like expectations for ourselves that we may or may not be able to like execute or actualize, right? So I think we often see them struggle to navigate these expectations, and not always be able to do it because there are still some residual symptoms, or struggle to do it, or do it in a very different way than we're accustomed to seeing them do it, right? But in fact, it's a really good thing that they are able to have those expectations and work through them, regardless of their capacity, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to framing it, Hannah. Before we go on, I just wanted to let everyone know as well on the YouTube that if you have questions, you can begin to submit those on the YouTube live chat. We do have someone on the team who's looking at the chat and observing it, and we'll begin to pull those questions together into different themes. So when we get to the section on audience Q&A, we can begin to answer those. So feel free to begin using the chat for that if you haven't already. So with that said, what you all were just talking about things changing and evolving, that's a really good segue into our next segment, which is about how the path changes over time. So when progress stalls or tension builds, many people start to wonder whether the plan itself has failed, right? And this next part is about reframing that moment. So let's dive into some questions here. Over time, how do recovery paths usually change, even when care has been thoughtful? Start with Gale.
That's a tough one because, as we've kind of all alluded to, it's just so, up and down, and one day is different than the next, and then sometimes you have a couple steps back and a couple steps forward. So I guess I really don't have a good answer for that one.
That's fine. That's fine, because you're living in the moment right now, right? And you're trying to navigate it and seeing what it means. So that's an honest, lovely answer, and that's everything we would hope to hear and see how you change over time as that moves forward. Brittany, how about you? How would you answer that question from your perspective?
Yeah. I think a lot about the plans that we build, right? And how oftentimes we're thinking about what we want the next step to look like, right? Or what we want the next part of the world to look like. And we put it into action, right? When we start planning, we start doing it, we start practicing things, and then we're going, all right, hold on, this wasn't the result I was hoping for, right? And that requires some reflection. And I think working with the team that is around you on reflecting on that of, this isn't what I was expecting. It's not what my loved one was expecting. Help me understand where we're at today. And sometimes the plan is what's wrong, right? Like sometimes even when we did plan the best way we could, there's changes that need to happen or can happen to make things better. Other times, and I'll say I'm incredibly guilty of this, is that I get impatient, right? And I thought that it was going to happen faster than it did. And so I look at the plan and I'm going, the plan's not working because the plan's not planning. It's not getting where I wanted to be, right? And it really is about slowing myself down and slowing down my own expectations of saying, okay, is the plan not working, or is it not working as fast as I thought it would? The answer is usually the second one. And I hear this from families all the time, right? That, well, when I think back on what has worked, sticking to the plan and just staying steady and consistent is what has led to so much improvement. And it didn't happen as fast as I wanted it to. And, one of our other NPs today, I heard her say this beautiful thing that, oftentimes when there's these blips on the radar, because there's always blips on the radar, right? Like, recovery is not a linear path. We have relapses. We have moments that don't feel like we're moving in the direction we want to. And don't we all, right? Don't we all have bad weeks? And so she said, I always encourage families just pause for 3 weeks. Give it 3 weeks. And if it hasn't gotten better, then maybe we need to change the plan. And I just love that idea of like, just hit the pause button for a second, because sometimes that's all we need.
That's really great. I like how you were mentioning as well that, we're all impatient, especially in the society that we live in today. Everything is like instant gratification. We want it and we want it now. But sometimes things need to germinate. Like you plant the seed, you want the crop to grow. It's going to take the time that it's going to take in order to make that happen. And similarly, as you were saying, Brittany, our plans could take a similar shape. Sometimes it's just time that needs to kind of marinate a bit more, and then things will begin to germinate as humans evolve. And other times, the plan may actually need to change. Hannah, from your perspective, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, I was thinking about that in reference to medication, of course, all the time, right? Sometimes we learn, the families, the loved ones, we learn that to be and we were talking about this today, Brittany, but we learn to be so reactive because the individual has been in crisis for so long that we've become hypervigilant. And that, sort of applies to medication too, where providers will think like, oh, there was one bad day or a couple bad days. We got to change it. We got to change everything up. We got to change the dosages. And, so we providers end up reinforcing this hypervigilance and reactivity sometimes. And like, of course, there are moments where like, yes, there's a pattern. We need to adjust things. But I think that reactivity isn't always founded or helpful in itself, because the reality of the illness, like you were saying, Gale, is there are just so many ups and downs, and that is the illness, and the illness changes, especially when people are young, right? And their illness is still developing, even though we've done our best to prevent any further like harm or degradation, right?
Exactly. Gale, would you like an opportunity to kind of touch on that once you've heard these other responses? Do you want to add any more color to this question from your perspective?
Well, I agree with everything that was said, and there's also an anxiety that you feel as the person or as a family member who has gone through all this. And sometimes I have to talk to myself and say, hey, everything's okay. He's safe. Tomorrow's another day. So we as caregivers have a lot of issues we need to deal with as well. And like, Brittany said, that's great about, okay, let's give it 3 weeks, take a breath, see how it works out is very good advice.
When people begin to re-engage with life after a long plateau, what tends to support that process?
Well, we're not there yet, but again, with the anxiety, sometimes I think, okay, if he starts re-engaging, and is he going to make the right friends? Is he going to, are they going to be kind to him at work? So, that's I'm sure other parents feel the same way, but there's a lot of anxiety to go around. But I think, to me, success as a mom would be knowing that when I depart, he will have a community, and he'll be able to function on his own and be, the new definition of happiness. That would be, to me, recovery.
Thank you, Gale. That was really beautiful. Brittany, how would you answer that question from your perspective?
A little caught in how beautifully said that was, Gale. Just reacting emotionally a little. I think when we kind of move into this state, you know what? Would you mind rewording that question, Patrick? I just got a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. No worries.
My emotions there.
No worries. No worries. This is real. And this is why we're having the conversation, right? When people begin to re-engage with life after a long plateau, that re-engagement could be like deeply re-engaging or some small step. What tends to support that process of re-engagement?
Thank you. That was the word I was missing. I think the biggest part of the support of the re-engagement is having a community of people around you who are truly walking arm in arm with you and partnering with you, not pushing, not pulling, but just gently present in your world with you, and rebuilding those relationships and social connections in the right timing, right, for each individual and what's best for them without causing more distress. But truly, as Gale was saying, that like hoping for your loved one to have this full community, it really is. And sometimes it just starts with the people right next to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
The people closest to you, truly building reconnection and that social connection. I think oftentimes we forget about that element of health. That social connection is so critical for all of us. And rebuilding that is just such an important part of moving in that direction.
Well said. I think, people tend to forget that we're all relational creatures, right? And this opportunity to connect with people, build something within us that is life-giving. And what you just said really hit that on the head. Thank you for sharing that, Brittany. Hannah, from the clinical perspective, when people begin to re-engage with life after a long plateau, what tends to support that process on the clinical side?
I mean, as someone who focuses on medication and clinical diagnostics a lot of the time, I have to say, like, it's all psychosocial, right? It's such a huge and critical element of recovery. And it certainly is I feel, one of the most critical elements in this sort of messy middle stage, because like we said, there are all these parts of a person that are starting to reemerge, and they need to be able to test and validate those, whether it's through, programming, through therapy, through community integration, work, volunteering, whatever it is, they need those opportunities because they need to build up those skills and learn why those opportunities are meaningful again. And I am complicit in this because I do focus on medication a lot of the time, but I feel like medication often takes the front seat, right? Like we tend to fixate on getting the meds right, but there's so much of it that has nothing to do with meds,
That's really helpful. That's really helpful framing, because I think most of us come from this. I think society has been groomed to believe that medicine will fix everything, right? And we forget that, no, it's not medicine. Medicine helps with some portion of it that will enable us to re-engage from the psychosocial perspective, which you mentioned, Hannah, as the lion's share of our recovery. So thank you for sharing that. That's actually a good segue to the next question about pacing. So how do pacing, structure, and environment often matter as much as internal motivation? Start with Gale.
I don't really. I'm not knowledgeable enough, I don't think, to answer that question. I'm hoping to learn that through, the groups, and hoping that Andrew, or my son, will learn how to pace it too. He and I will have to learn it together. I don't really have a good answer for that.
No, that's actually a great answer, right? Because you said that you both will have to learn it together, right? And that in and of itself is a way of pacing. So it's a phenomenal answer. Like, thank you, Gale, for sharing that and being so honest about that. Brittany, how about from your perspective?
The word that comes to mind often is like, don't undercut baby steps, right? None of us learn to walk by running first, right? We start with a couple of small, tenuous steps, and those count, right? I think back to what Gale said earlier about, just making the bed is a huge win sometimes, right? And using those to build on for pacing, right? And another individual I met recently, she talked about, I just loved this concept that she sort of inventories and keeps an archive of the solutions her loved one has come up with and his strengths, and that she builds on those. So every time there's a new challenge that her loved one's facing, she's remember, right, this past solution you found. Do you think that might apply here? Remember this past strength you found. Do you think that might apply here? And I think that's so beautiful to think about. There's little baby steps, building blocks towards moving forward. And pacing is dependent on how many of those building blocks we can stack up, right, to really get that motivation going.
That's a powerful image. Very, very powerful image. I remember hearing someone talk one time about us forgetting like how far we've come, right? Because we're always looking forward, right? And so when we're looking to that next opportunity, it seems so far in the distance. And if we just take a moment to like step back and like look back to see where we are, I'm getting emotional here talking about it myself. You've come so far, right? And we need to kind of take the time to celebrate those moments and understand that those are part of our recovery. So the next question I have here for you all, actually, we have to move to the next section. So the next section is about audience Q&A. Hannah, did I give you a chance to respond to that question?
No, but keep going.
Yeah. All right. So the next section is audience Q&A. So if you haven't already, please submit questions via the chat. I'll put this banner up here to remind you. And I'm going to bring on one of our other team members. Her name is Stephanie, who has been curating the chat, looking at it, and trying to bring together questions, potentially to theme them or to pick very specific ones that can speak to a kind of a broader range. So Stephanie, come on stage and turn your camera.
All right. Thanks so much, Patrick. It's been just such a pleasure listening to you all and the conversation. And we have a really wonderfully engaged audience. Like, the first thing that stands out is just how much they relate to what you all have been saying. OMG, Gale, your comment is so touching. And that some of the comments just really hit the nail on the head for some of the folks in here. So I wanted to share that with you all, so you feel the energy of the folks that have been chatting in. I think as the conversation's been going, there have been some different themes and questions come up, and then some of the times we've gotten to those themes. But I think one of the themes that we got some questions about that we haven't talked too much about is some questions kind of specific to treatment. So someone asked, can life stabilize without meds? And kind of that topic. Also, is there effective therapy to deal with the intense emotional distress? And also a specific question about therapy for caregivers. So I was wondering if you all could just kind of touch on this theme of treatment and maybe address some of those specific questions.
Great. Who would like to take the first shot?
I can address the med question. I think with a true serious mental illness that's accurately diagnosed, you know, and sort of a true psychosis spectrum illness, it's going to be very, very hard to manage it without medication, if not impossible. The outcomes we have just don't, you know, totally support that option, even though, like, of course, some people choose to go that route. But yeah, so I think it's tough.
Thanks, Anna. Brittany, how about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of these questions just around treatment and around therapies available and things like that. I think the answer is absolutely. There are some really incredible therapeutic modalities out there. And, you know, I think the question was specific to sort of the intense emotional dysregulation that comes along with this. And for different people, there's different types of therapy and different therapists that land well for you. One of the ones we often are recommending is CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy, particularly finding providers who are trained in understanding the psychosis spectrum as they're delivering that CBT. Another one that's really powerful is dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. So those therapists tend to be very well trained in the emotion dysregulation sort of management of things. And really the most important thing is just finding a provider who you feel like you connect with. I think that is the most important part of therapy, is someone who can help you sort of unpack and find that step forward in a way that is both relational and connected, as well as challenging and helps you move. And therapy for families, I say all the time, like, we should all be in therapy at some time or another. It is just so important for us to reflect on our experiences, even if it's just for a short time, to be able to be in a space with someone who understands this experience and can help you reflect back on what you've gone through as a caregiver as well, because this does impact you as well.
Awesome. Gale, is there any part of those questions that you want to kind of touch on a little bit?
Oh, I agree with everything that Hannah and Brittany have said. Another observation I've made is that there are some medical professionals that I've encountered that don't realize how important it is to involve the family, that it's really, in this situation, it's so very important that the caregiver, the physician, the therapist, that we're all on the same sheet of music supporting one another. To me, that's sometimes difficult to find, but very important.
Yeah, definitely. It takes a village, like all these people from different perspectives coming together towards the charge of an individual. Stephanie, next one.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you for touching on all those pieces of the theme. There's a few questions that have come up, and then, you know, particularly lately, as people have answering them about a loved one that might not be seeking help, they're refusing help, anosognosia, these themes. I was wondering, you know, I think, you know, in general, people are asking about this. How do we engage someone that might be refusing help? But I also wonder how this relates to the messy middle. You know, can you be in the messy middle? Is that just kind of getting things started to refuse help, or how does kind of refusing help show up in the messy middle, and how can our tools of support help with that problem?
Great. Gale, you're in the messy middle right now, as you shared earlier. Do you want to touch on that a little bit first?
I am in the messy middle, or we are in the messy middle, and I'm thankfully, my loved one is aware of what's going on with him. He's compliant with his medication, and I'm, you know, I've probably used this word a million times already, but I'm so very grateful that he's there. And so I don't really I don't really know what to say for somebody who's going through that, only that my heart goes out to them and I wish them well.
Thank you, Gale. Thank you. Brittany, you want to tackle that next?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that came up as Stephanie was asking, like, can you be in the messy middle and navigating this sort of refusal of help is sometimes it does happen, right? That our loved ones start to feel so great that it feels like they don't need the medications anymore. They don't need the same level of support that they did, from their psychiatrist or their therapist. And so they start to peel back from all of these things that have been helping. And as a result, end up in this state of relapse and sort of back in this place of not recognizing their illness in the same way that they did before. And that can be so devastating for us as caregivers. So just want to name that if that's been your experience, it's really, really hard. And, in talking to other family caregivers who've been through that, I think it's recognizing that this is hard and this is not what you prepared for and you didn't expect this to happen. And you have the tools and the resources that you didn't have the first time around, right? And I think when we've hit this crisis moment, it's really easy to lose sight of the fact that we've already learned and grown so much. And it might not be the perfect answer, but it's a start, right? And it helps, again, those like building blocks and those strengths that we had that we can build on to help our loved ones back into re-engaging with their care.
Thanks, Brittany. I also like how you mentioned there that, may not be the first time around. So we have certain tools that you can now utilize and kind of pull out of the bag to utilize. And then there's new things that you learned in the process, because again, everyone is an individual and everyone's evolving as time moves forward. And then you may take a different tactic, but at the same time, it's all about being present with your loved one and allowing the process to germinate. Hannah, anything from your perspective on that one?
I think about this pulling from different modalities, but with, anosognosia, I think the families often find it very helpful to think about what are the person's motivations, what are their goals, even if they are not, those goals and motivations are not grounded in reality, right? Those are the things that they're already motivated by. So framing things in terms of progress towards that outcome that they already desire makes a lot of sense. It's very hard to do in the moment, but I think trying to think about reframing things for the person in a way that is relatable, which is, a way that relates to their personal, their personal goals. It's really helpful.
Thanks, Hannah. That's a really good reframing as well. Stephanie, next theme or question?
Yeah. Thank you. We've gotten a couple of questions and comments that are specific to voice hearing. So someone has commented about somebody feeling a sense of belonging or wanting to stay connected to voices that are otherwise problematic. We also got a recent question about, is it okay to talk about how to deal with the illness so far with your loved one, and to know whether our loved one is still hearing voices and still struggles with that. Kind of how do we navigate those conversations when voices are coming in and they have kind of their own maybe relationships kind of going on? How can caregivers interact in those circumstances?
Great. Okay, this time we'll start with Hannah. I think we've started with Gale and Brittany the last 2 times. Hannah, I'll start with you.
I think, we should never discount like the value and the emotional meaning that people derive from the voices, the delusions, the beliefs, right? They can play a very big role in people's lives for a significant amount of time, to the point where when they're on medication or doing well, they feel a loss and they can feel lonely because of it. So I think just having empathy for that is really important, and patience with that recovery process. It's also, again, why those social and psychosocial elements are so important, because people often need help sort of filling that void, right, of what happens when like the company you had for so long is not as present, right? Yeah. And I also think asking very directly if your loved one is experiencing those symptoms as those symptoms and they're identifying them, hallucinations, or in whatever way they're identifying them. I often have patients identify their hallucinations as anxiety or my ADD, and I usually just reframe using the language they're already using. It's because they're already identifying it. We don't need to re-identify it for them or correct them. I think that can be very helpful.
Yeah, you said something there, Hannah, that I never realized until you just said it right now, that someone who has been living with these voices for a long time, or hallucinations, when they start to abate or go away, that they're missing something now. That void needs to kind of be filled with something else. That's very real, right? Like there's a separation there that, if you pull too hard, it's like tearing open like a wound, right? So that's really profound. Brittany, do you want to go next?
Sure. Sort of echoing on this, or continuing what Hannah was saying about how to have these conversations. I think one of the themes and the questions was, is it okay to have these conversations? And I hope you're hearing from us, like, absolutely, please lean into these conversations as much as you can, and recognize that, like, sometimes these conversations are going to feel really awkward, right? And you're not going to know exactly what to say or how to respond. And I think the most important part, as Hannah was saying, is just being present and responding back with what our loved one's saying and just validating it. Right? Use their words. It sounds like, the name of your voice was really, supportive for you, and you're missing that. Am I understanding that right? Right? Repeat back what they're saying, validate what they're saying, and then ask curious questions, right? I think my favorite is just tell me more, right? I'd love to hear more about that. It's a really simple way to just get your loved one to share as much as they're comfortable sharing, and be comfortable with silence. I think that's one of those areas that I sometimes, have to sit with, is my loved one might not be ready to say a lot, but if I give them silence and space and my presence, they'll start to open up more. My silence gives them more space than my questions do.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times when you give space for just quiet, that begins to bring down barriers, right? And then more openness is given the opportunity to kind of emerge into that space, which is really powerful. Thanks for sharing that, Brittany. Gale, anything from your perspective on that?
I've really enjoyed listening to Hannah and Brittany on both those subjects. And I think doing what they're saying also kind of, I'm not going to say it normalizes what they're going through, but it says, hey, it's okay. This is, it's okay to talk about it. It's part of this disorder, or whatever you'd want to call it. So it's a healthy thing. It's okay.
Thank you, Gale. Appreciate that. Stephanie, next question or theme.
Yeah. Thanks for that. We also have been receiving kind of comments coming in, giving us the 100 emoji, and people talking about how, losing the voices have made them difficult. Also others saying, they're persecutory voices. So this really hit a lot of questions with our audience. Also among that came some new questions on the theme of THC and how to approach that. Some questions about a loved one claiming that or just stating that THC helps them quiet their mind. How do we kind of think about that when they're saying it's helpful, and then how to help guide those health choices, and maybe just what do we know about THC and its effects in psychosis?
Great. All right, let's start with it looks like Hannah was getting ready to answer right away.
Yeah, I feel like that. I can take that one. I think I hear that a lot about THC being supportive for people in psychosis. And, we know through the literature that it does tend to worsen psychotic symptoms and anxiety overall. Also if you're chronically smoking marijuana early on in psychosis, or maybe during a prodromal stage, it can bring out the psychosis sooner than you would have had it anyways. So it does have significant negative impacts. However, we can't invalidate someone's experience with it. Like they feel like it's therapeutic in the moment. And in the moment, I imagine, and this is true with a lot of people who use substances during psychosis, is there's some anxiety reprieve that comes from it. And it's a break, So I think it's a very complicated thing to balance. If someone's smoking or using THC regularly, I think about, well, is there a way they can do it in a less harmful way, or could they do slightly less of it, or if they're smoking, smoke one time a day instead of 3, whatever it is, to take that step, and then see if you can sustain it. If there is another component to smoking, especially smoked THC or marijuana, right, that it can reduce clozapine levels for people who are on clozapine. It can reduce it significantly because of the smoke itself. So anyone on the call who's on that specific medication wants to be aware of that.
Thanks, Hannah. Appreciate that. I know it's focused on THC, but from the perspective of the caregiver, Gale, is there anything that you want to share about that?
Well, I have my own personal opinions based on my reading, but I'm not a trained professional, so I don't think I should comment.
That's great. And Brittany, from your perspective as a family coach?
I think that a big part of this, as Hannah was alluding to, is it's super hard. Excuse me as I lose my voice here. It's really hard to see our loved ones engaging in something that doesn't feel like what we'd hope for them, if we don't truly understand the motivations behind it. And where Hannah was saying, like, it can provide a break, it can provide this respite. From the family coach perspective, I always encourage asking questions around getting curious of, tell me why, right? Tell me what what does it help? What benefit are you getting out of it? And does anything else in your life provide that same benefit, right? To try to help your loved one come up with the things on their own that might alleviate that craving or that need, or fill that need in the same way that the substance does.
That's really great, Brittany. Thank you for sharing that. Stephanie, next question.
Yeah. So there was another quite big theme, but it was a bit early on in the conversation around rebuilding, and some people shared stories about how a series of psychotic breaks led to losing a job, every year because of the episodes coming back, or having a period where it's been long and folks have lost their jobs, or someone described it as, how do you get someone out of the pit? And I think that there was already, some discussion on this theme of rebuilding. But I thought that some of these questions around how do we kind of deal with the loss of these things and like what's happened, like repairing old friendships, or kind of thinking about old work experiences could be helpful. And then somebody also recently just chimed in with, are there workplaces that can be knowledgeable and sensitive to disabilities? So I know that wasn't a pointed question, but just on that theme of rebuilding, maybe touching a little bit on dealing with the loss of what has been. And then like specific opportunities that people might be able to capitalize on.
Great. So just to say that one more time, it's how do we kind of deal with the loss of what we could do before? You also mentioned potentially like repairing those things, whether or not we should talk about that. And then what opportunities are there for our current state that takes that into account, that enable us to proceed towards meaningful life.
Yeah.
Great. Start with Brittany on this one.
Yeah. I think one of the first things that comes to mind is there's this concept of ambiguous grief, sort of this ability that we hold this tension between grieving a loss of something that we had or we anticipated, while also holding hope for a future that's different, and how living in that tension can feel particularly difficult to navigate, because we can kind of go between these stages of grief and mourning a loss, while also then going back to, well, I can also hold hope that the future can be different. And giving a name to that experience and validating that that's a normal part of this process, to experience both grief and hope at the same time, can be really powerful. And then in terms of, what are the tangible steps? Are there workplaces? Are there ways to get support as an individual living with severe mental illness that might be, otherwise debilitating? The answer is absolutely yes, there are. And there are some really incredible programs out there. Many counties have them in sort of workforce centers that can help do what's called vocational rehabilitation, really working with your loved one and partnering with them on getting to those next steps, whatever that means for them, to get back into a workplace that can support them. And there are federal protections for individuals who have disabilities that your loved ones can seek in their workplaces as well.
Thanks, Brittany. That's really helpful framing for thinking about how do we continue to make strides while thinking about rebuilding. Gale, do you want to talk a little bit more about that from your perspective?
Well, that's a good resource, which I didn't know about. And then I guess when your loved one is ready to, take that step, because in my case, he was employed at one time, and it's not like you have a broken arm and people have compassion and say, oh, okay, let me help you. This is something that does not garner compassion. And then there's, shame and embarrassment. So it's a tough one to walk, a tough road to walk. But I guess if you go to those resources, that's helpful, because then the workplace already knows we have to be helpful in this situation. And so that's a good resource. Thanks, Brittany.
That's great. Stephanie, next theme.
I think one of the questions that kind of jumps out at me to think about in this context is we've talked a lot about kind of nurturing and rebuilding and building a stable life, but someone pointed out, sometimes our loved ones' ambitions are actually 10 miles ahead, and we know that there's a readiness for that, and you might not, to get there, they might be, trying to challenge themselves too much and moving in that direction too much. How do we kind of manage that as a caregiver or a treatment team, and help someone when they might be thinking they're at a different level of stability than we might as caregivers, coaches, clinicians?
It's a good question. I don't think I need to reframe that one. Let's start with Brittany on that one.
Yeah, I love that this question came up, because it came up in another conversation I was having recently as well, is that, we often want to be so supportive of our loved ones' ambitions, especially in this stage of, re-engaging in life, that we get just as excited as they are about something that might feel much bigger than their capacity today. And, one of the things that I encourage people to do is, how can you remain supportive while also providing a safety net, and recognizing that there are going to be things that our loved ones want to try that might fail, right? As many of us might want to try something, and being the safety net that provides, protection against catastrophic failure, in a way that's super harmful, versus, sometimes we have to try the really big thing and find it doesn't work, to then readjust our expectations. And sometimes our loved ones surprise us. I think that's the other thing that I have to remind myself of too, is that I oftentimes see things as way bigger and way more grand than I think my loved ones are prepared for. And they surprise me in what they're able to accomplish that I might not have had the courage and bravery to try.
Mm-hmm.
I like how you talk about courage and bravery, Brittany. We were talking about confidence much earlier in the conversation, and then bringing it back around to courage and bravery, almost as like a full circle kind of moment. Yeah, any comments on that question?
I couldn't add anything more. I think it was perfect. You covered it all. It's true. It's so hard to decide, do I encourage or do I protect them? And sometimes that's not a good thing either.
Thanks, Gale. Appreciate that. We are at time for the Q&A session. Thank you, Stephanie, for coming up on top and looking at all of the questions and theming them for us. I know there's a bunch of questions that people have asked, and we probably didn't get to all of them. We try to theme them as best as we can, but look out for future events where we may be able to answer more of these questions. So before we wrap up, we're going to dive into a more of a closing, and what we want to talk about is blame and self-blame, right? And throughout this process, as we're watching our loved ones get better, go back and forth, sometimes we allow self-blame to kind of start to creep in, and self-blame doesn't help like anyone, right? And so if people could release like one source of self-blame in this phase, what would matter most? And let's start with Brittany on this one.
Man, choosing what matters most and releasing this self-blame and shame is a challenging one, because I think there's a lot of things up there. I think the first thing is recognizing and naming it for what it is, and recognizing the messages we receive from the world, and we might internalize in a way that's not productive for us. As you said, Patrick, like, blame is never going to solve the problem, and that includes blaming ourselves. And I've been there, right? I have walked down that path of internalizing every question a provider has asked me, every seemingly innocuous intake question that seems to point at there's something I could have done differently to stop my loved one from being in the place that they are. And it took a lot of work to release that and to recognize that even if that were true, I was doing my best with what I knew and what I had available to me in a world that I can't control. And that was such an important thing for me to recognize and release the shame, is that I did the best I know how to now, and tomorrow when I know something different, I'll do something different. And just holding on to that has been a huge part of releasing that shame and blame. And then also recognizing that there are a lot of pieces of this puzzle that I had zero control over. And this world is one in which there are a lot of inputs that despite my best attempts at protecting my loved ones, I won't be able to, right? And recognizing that this is where we're at, and there's no point in pointing the fingers back at myself or at anyone else, that we just have to keep moving forward.
Thank you, Brittany. That was really profound. Thank you for sharing that. Gale, from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to top that one, Brittany. I mean, it was perfectly said, and it's true. I think as a caregiver, you want to protect your children, and his destiny, we thought, was going to be one way, and it looks like it's not. It's something different. But he's become he's always been a strong person, but imagine the strength you gain going through this terrible, terrible adversity. I mean, I can't even imagine. I don't think I could have come out as well as he has. He's just tenacious and amazing. And I tell myself that that was his destiny. And now I use that phrase oftentimes, let go, let God, because I can't control everything. I can't make everything right. I can only do my best and, love them and support them.
I think that's all we can ask for, right? Like, doing your best in the moment with all the information you have, and loving the individual, right? On both sides. Hannah, anything you want to add to that? Like, if you could release one sort of self-blame in this phase, what would matter most?
Yeah, I think just sort of echoing what you both have already said, but making sure that, you and your loved one both have agency where you're able to, and letting go of the areas that you don't, right? And sometimes it's, one small choice that you have agency over, and the rest is just out of your control. And that's what there is, right? And that's what you have access to. Yeah, I think that's sort of part of the message of what you guys were trying to get at. And that's what I see a lot of caregivers and individuals struggling with.
Thank you, Hannah. One last question here. What do you wish people understood earlier about this stage of recovery, the messy middle? And this time we'll start with Gale.
Okay, I'll just sum it up with something I learned at NAMI, and that was, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. and it is.
Mhm.
Thank you, Gale. That's a great image. Brittany.
I mean, I think that almost sums it up, right? Is that it isn't fast. And there, even the marathon image, I sometimes struggle with because it implies that there's a finish line.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the things that I wish people understood earlier in the process, is that we're not racing towards a finish line. We're building perseverance and endurance. I think of it a little bit more like hiking the Appalachian Trail and then continuing on going, right? It's about building the endurance for the long haul, and then making space for recharging, right? And taking these opportunities when we are in the messy middle, like as we started this, right? Like there's this sigh of relief that comes with, we're not in acute crisis, and it's okay to rest. I think I sometimes encourage people that you've been running so hard. Take some time to rest in this journey and then regroup, build the endurance for the next part.
Thanks, Brittany. That's amazing. Hannah, from your perspective, any last?
I think to reiterate what you guys are saying, I like the marathon and the Appalachian Trail analogies. I think, something that I would like to have families and individuals understand is the same as what you guys said, but also, that recovery isn't one fixed point in time or fixed state of being. It's it develops over time, and it's very subjective, and we all define it differently, and families and caregivers will define it very differently than individuals who are in treatment, right? So it's something to remember, that this isn't this like final end point or climax that you're reaching, right? It's sort of this like slow progress. It's just part of your life that you're already living, and it's and it's the same as a lot of elements of life that move slowly and have progress over many years, and you only see the change when you look back and reflect, right? So I think it's similar in that theme.
Thanks, Hannah. From what I heard from all three of you, essentially you were saying as well that this recovery again is non-linear, which was mentioned way earlier in this conversation. And I like to kind of share something I saw. I think it was like a month or so ago. One of my good friends is suffering through grief, through loss of a loved one from cancer, and I came across this video of there's an individual, and he's climbing up these stairs, right? And next to the stairs is this trampoline. There's an orchestra around this playing music, and then there are people who are watching this expression, and it's about grief. And this individual starts walking up the steps one at a time, and every step he goes up, he comes back 2 more times, 2 steps. He goes up 3 steps, goes down 1 step. And as he keeps climbing up this ladder, he begins to fall to the side, to the left where the trampoline is, take him all the way back to ground zero. Then he bounces back up, but not quite to the step he was at, but 1 step behind that. And he's slowly making his progress to the top platform. And once he gets there, he just barely makes it. He falls again all the way back down. And he keeps bouncing, but his bouncing is not getting as high as he was before. It keeps going lower and lower and lower and lower and lower and lower. And then suddenly he starts to get more energy, and he's getting higher and higher and higher and higher. He eventually ends up all the way back on the top of the platform. He's not the same individual. He's different. But that image and that expression really pointed home to me what recovery from grief looks like, right? It's not that you've overcome this grief and this pain that's there, but your life is different now, and you have a different way of moving forward, and you have a meaningful life. So thank you all for joining us today. I appreciate you all being here, joining us and asking a lot of questions. It's our first time again doing this in a YouTube live format. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please let us know in the comments and we'll look at any questions, and we hope to do more of these events in the future. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Gale. And thank you, Hannah, for being barraged by all my questions and answering them truthfully and honestly. And Stephanie, thank you as well for looking at the chat and pulling all the questions together. Everyone, have a good evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.